Hello and welcome to the Feck It Fun, Fabulous and Free Eating Disorder Recovery podcast. I'm Helly and I'm here to provide regular bursts of information and inspiration, some neuroscience applicable to eating disorder recovery, perhaps a few rants, but otherwise lots of positivity with a bit of a feck it attitude, some fun and a sprinkling of fabulousness to help everyone find freedom in recovery. Hi everyone. Well, isn't this a nice surprise? Here I am with another episode of the Feck It Fun, Fabulous and Free Eating Disorder Recovery podcast. And I'd been half thinking about making another podcast but hadn't got around to it when a very nice listener emailed me this week to say that they'd been struggling with a slight relapse recently and would I make an episode on how to prevent relapses when you're going through the recovery process or when you are considering yourself recovered and contemplating going back to things like exercise or whatever it might be that obviously carries more risk. So I thought, okay, that is an excellent idea. I've obviously not spoken about lapses and relapses on this podcast series up until now, and that's quite remiss of me. So I thought, yep, okay. So I'm pulling on a lot of the information that's actually in my books. The first is Addicted to Energy Deficit and the second book is Aiming for Overshoot. So some of the information is in those books, especially the information I'm going to talk about in this episode, which largely comes from Addicted to Energy Deficit. And this is the first of 3 podcast episodes I'm going to be making, which I'm going to put out in quite quick succession in the next week or two on this topic of relapse and lapses. Look out for the other episodes as well. So I think it's important to say, first of all, that lapses, relapses and prelapses are part of the cycle of recovery from an eating disorder, just as they are from any powerful addiction. I'm going to give you an oversight of these critical points in the recovery circle so that you can be aware of it, aware of the signs that maybe you're heading into a lapse or a relapse, what you can do to prevent that situation, and then if you do notice it's happening, what you do about it. So this episode is the first in a series of 3, as I say, on the topic of relapse. And in this episode, I cover what lapses, relapses, and prelapses are, and the differences between these 3 concepts. And I'm also going to explore what's happening in your brain when you experience a lapse or a relapse. Then the next podcast episode is going to be about the signs and symptoms that you are experiencing a lapse or relapse, and what to do if you notice things are sliding. And as I say, the final episode is going to talk about how to prevent a lapse or relapse and what to do to give yourself the best chance of getting and staying firmly in a fully recovered state. So let's talk first about relapses with an eating disorder, because relapse is the term you're most likely to be familiar with. Now, a relapse in relation to an addiction or eating disorder is when you have all but overcome the addictive disorder, but then you return to fully using your drug again. And of course, in the case of an eating disorder, I consider the drug to be energy deficit. That's the thing that your brain is addicted to, and it's the behaviours that lead you to energy deficit that become then so powerfully compulsive because your brain is trying to pull you towards its drug of being an energy deficit. So with a relapse, perhaps you've fully abstained from all the eating disorder habits for a prolonged period. You're fully out of energy deficit and you've restored to your set point weight. Your brain circuitry driving the eating disordered behaviours has been unwired from the old habits, and new non-disordered habits have wired in strongly, so those are now automatic. Your dopamine deficit has restored to a healthy level, And ultimately, you have fully overcome the eating disorder mentally as well as physically. So then a relapse is said to have occurred when you're at this recovered point, but then you re-enter a state of energy deficit, triggering a new positive reward response. And that reward response pushes you back into the pursuit of those previously addictive disordered behaviours and the fixes the energy deficit creates for you. Really, a relapse is defined as a full-blown return to the eating disorder, and that can occur months, years, or even decades after you'd overcome it. Lapses then with an eating disorder are less significant than a full relapse, but they still need to be acted on and acted on very quickly. So an example of a lapse is if you've all but overcome an eating disorder but start dabbling again in old behaviours, and then you quickly realise and you abstain from them again. Now, lapses can be used as learning opportunities. So, for example, if you have a lapse because of a stressful life event, it can be a sign that you need better support systems for when the next inevitable life stress hits. And the term lapse can also be used when you take a backward step in pursuit of fully overcoming the eating disorder. So in that case, the term relapse isn't appropriate, because for a relapse, you should first have reached a recovered state. So when you're still in the process to fully overcome the eating disorder, a lapse is when you've made good progress, but then find that your urges and cravings become stronger again, luring you back into a higher level of engagement in the addictive behaviours, which in turn creates a deeper energy deficit. Now, it has to be said, and really take this on board, that lapses in the recovery process are natural and common. Lapses are part of the recovery process. But each time they happen, it's key to notice them as soon as possible, learn from them, and then put measures in place to prevent them from recurring. So that's lapses and that's relapses. The term you might not be so familiar with is the term prelapse. Prelapse is a much less commonly used term, but it's something that's important to be aware of. Now, a prelapse is when some thought patterns are beginning to revert back to the eating disorder, but before your behaviours have followed. So the stage of prelapse can begin a reasonable time before you engage in the old behaviours again, or it can precede a faster descent back to the destructive pursuit of energy deficit. So I'm going to give you some examples of increasing thoughts that you might have, which can be a sign of a prelapse when you've all but overcome the eating disorder. So thoughts like, surely it can't hurt to lose a couple of pounds now. Or, yeah, I don't think I need that bag of crisps today with my sandwich for lunch because I'm going out for dinner tonight. Or, yeah, maybe I will take up long-distance cycling. Yeah, I don't think that's going to hurt when during the eating disorder it was running I was addicted to. These thoughts indicate the onset of new cravings for a hit of energy deficit, and they are a sign of a prelapse. Recognizing that these kinds of thoughts are increasing and that it's a danger and a warning sign to you is really important, because if you don't address it when these thoughts are coming in, it could lead on to a lapse or even a full relapse if you were already recovered. And there are some other signs that could be an indication of a prelapse, and these include a general increase in your irritability or anger levels, becoming more defensive about certain behaviours or habits, or being increasingly dishonest with yourself or loved ones, experiencing some signs of depression or a low mood, more negative thoughts or an increasingly pessimistic outlook on life, becoming increasingly busy and on the go, not allowing yourself to stop mentally and or physically, or disengaging from support systems that you have in place. During the recovery process and afterwards, it's so important to remain aware of your state of mind and being as much as you possibly can, because it's that's going to help to ensure that you quickly notice any signs of possible lapse or relapse so that you address them quickly. Because otherwise that slope back to the eating disorder, even when you thought you were bulletproof, can actually be very slippery. That's then what lapses, relapses and prelapses are. But what's happening in your brain when you have a lapse or a relapse in eating disorder recovery? So if you've learnt about the process of brain reprogramming to overcome an eating disorder, and you'll find many episodes on this podcast series on that topic, you might think that once you've abstained from your drug of energy deficit for an extended period, your brain circuitry will be fully rewired, making relapses completely unlikely. And that is true to an extent, but unfortunately, some weeds from the old brain network that drove the eating disorder will linger. So to get into some basic neuroscience, to learn new things, the connections between the neurons, which are the brain cells that drive the new learning, form bonds with each other. And the more times the new learning is pursued, the stronger those bonds become, creating brain pathways and networks that make it easier to pursue them automatically. And at the same time, the connections between the neurons for habits that are no longer being pursued are weakened and depleted. And in that way, the brain circuits for old habits will begin to unwire. But in someone who's had a history of an eating disorder or addiction, it's thought that although there might not be active or conscious pursuit of the old circuits, the circuits can still be activated even years later. It could be at night you have dreams about engaging in some of your old eating disorder behaviours or of when you had a smaller body. Or perhaps you occasionally notice someone or see an influencer who's pursuing a life that is very health-driven or fitness-focused. And maybe you deem them to have a perfect and happy life, and you feel a fleeting moment of regret or sadness that isn't you. Those thoughts, emotions, and subconscious dreams can prevent the old synapses and circuits from fully breaking down. And while the old synapses are still present, if the right triggers come along, there's a risk of them being reactivated. And the other factor that makes an eating disorder brain circuit hard to fully remove is the power of the emotional and pleasure response that created it in the first place. So the floods of dopamine and other brain chemicals that occurred when you were pursuing the eating disordered circuits, especially at the beginning of the eating disorder, made for incredibly powerful fertilizer as your brain formed the synapses between those neurons. So these connections are likely to be stronger than any that your brain creates. And it might not be possible to fully break them down, just leaving those lingering weeds that you don't even realise are still there, but that do then present a degree of risk in your future. And of course, for anyone with a genetic susceptibility to a restrictive eating disorder, entering a state of prolonged energy deficit in future is also a lifelong risk to reigniting those old circuits. Any energy deficit beyond a key point in someone susceptible can switch back on the evolutionary flee from famine response. And again, if you don't know what I mean by the flee from famine response, then go back and listen to my episode on the evolutionary theory to eating disorders. So that's an ongoing risk factor to relapse that you need to stay very mindful of for life, deliberately pursuing a lifestyle that keeps you safely away from any degree of energy deficit. Now, I know that might all sound a little bit pessimistic, and for some of you, where your eating disorder brain is still trying to say to you, yeah, what's the point now in pursuing recovery? Because Helly's just said that actually you're always going to have these lingering wirings in your brain that could pull you back to the full eating disorder at any given moment. So what's the point? You know there's a point to fully overcoming the eating disorder because you can have an amazing life. And if you stay very mindful throughout your life that you can't go back into energy deficit, you can't engage in dieting in your future, you might not be able to ever decide to go and run marathons in your future. That these are things that you do to stay safe for life. If you stay aware of that, then your risk of the eating disorder ever returning is minimal to perhaps zero. So pursuing recovery is still absolutely worthwhile. And I would urge you to not just pursue recovery, but to slam your foot on the accelerator of how quickly you're currently pursuing your recovery. So don't be downhearted by the fact that, yes, there's a risk of lapse and relapse. But if it occurs, you can and you will deal with it, and you'll move on and you'll be stronger for it. So that's this episode. The next episode, I'm going to talk about the signs and symptoms that are likely to occur if you're experiencing a relapse or a lapse, because knowing those early signs is key to jumping on top of addressing it very quickly. Otherwise, my happy listeners, I hope you're doing okay. I'm aware that this is a stressful time of year for a lot of people. Yes, it can be very stressful, especially when you have an eating disorder and, oh my God, there's all this food everywhere and people are expecting you to eat it. Well, this is the perfect time to grab that anxiety about the fact it's Christmas again and decide that, okay, I could either get really anxious and terrified of Christmas and the fact that people want me to sit down and eat, and I could try and escape it and I could try and find any excuse not to be present at Christmas dinner. Or maybe I could decide that this is the perfect time to slam on the gas with my recovery and embrace every food opportunity there is while sitting on the couch under lots of blankets, unless you're in Australia where you might decide that it's a bit too hot to sit under lots of blankets. But you're going to sit, you're going to relax, you're going to embrace everything about Christmas that's wonderful. You're going to embrace the food, you're going to embrace resting and watching really rubbish Christmas films. And you're going to do that not just over Christmas, but until you are fully recovered. Decide this year can be different because it can. Yes, okay, that fear response is still going to try and show up, but predict it. Decide what you're going to do this time to address it. And just go for it. Anyway, go and grab some food right now. Decide that you are not heading to any lapse or relapse in your recovery. Go eat, go rest, relax, aim for overshoot, because that's always the best way to keep you safely out of any risk of lapse. And have a very lovely day. Speak to you soon. Thank you for listening to the Feck It Fun, Fabulous and Free Eating Disorder Recovery podcast. Don't forget, eating disorder recovery doesn't have to be boring and doesn't have to be serious. Now go and grab yourself some food and have a fabulous rest of the day.